It's hardly a secret, but it's also not something that most people think about, namely that reproduction is essentially what makes the world go round. And your average person is deeply, deeply concerned about it, either for themselves or in some cases for other people. And we need only look at an instance of reproductive controversy in the classic wedge issue of abortion, which is a great example of state level intervention in reproduction, broadly speaking, but is also an issue that tends to divide people and people feel very, very intensely about, either one way or another. As for myself, I'm not very invested in the issue of abortion, but it is one of those critical things that gets to people. Most people, in my observation, are either strongly pro-choice or strongly pro-life. People stage protests, etc., etc. And Roe versus Wade, in a historical sense, might be monumental by essentially, via fiat and decree, making the ability for women to terminate their pregnancies at will legal in every capacity, in every situation. But I don't want to spend too much time hung up on this wedge issue of abortion. I don't find it particularly interesting, and what I want to discuss goes well beyond that. Because the United States and other Western countries are also active in the reproduction business beyond the most obvious interventions, such as abortion, where you have actual fiat decree and medical intervention. I'm talking about other indirect mechanisms in place that create systematic problems in reproductive organization and structure. For example, the welfare state. And even though it's not been proven, there are strong correlations between the receipt of welfare money and the decline of fatherhood in certain communities, such as the black community, and increasingly also in white America. So reproductive intervention does not stop simply at abortion. It goes well beyond that. Because when you structure a society along the lines of, say, a Western-style democracy, such as the United States, you tend to get certain results. Single motherhood is a very, very common phenomenon. And all the data point to the idea of single parenthood not being good, which is to say that the ideal household is a mother, a father, etc., etc., and usually, not always, single parenthood is synonymous with single motherhood. And broadly speaking, if you look at mainstream media, single motherhood is praised. It's regarded as this amazing thing, the toughest job in the world, allegedly. And the reality underlying that is nowhere to be found. No doubt it is difficult to be a single parent or a single mother, but the idea is the toughest job in the world, very unlikely. And more to the point, it bestows all sorts of disadvantages, on average, upon the children of the single mother in question. But the West and the United States are by no means the only country in the game of controlling the means of reproduction. China's had a go at that for quite some time. In 1980, they issued forth their one-child policy, which has led to some interesting results. They've reversed this recently to 2 children. This had the result, of course, that there is a huge disparity between the number of females and males in the society, which of course has caused no small disruption to the usual mating rituals and reproductive strategies that would be present in an otherwise more or less parity-bound society, that is 50% males, 50% females. This is, quote-unquote, problematic, as Newspeak would have it, and there's no question to my mind whether it comes down to welfare or abortion or anything else, or limiting the number of children you can have by government fiat or decree, you can end up with some pretty wacky results going in one direction or the other. But today I want to reference an article, which I will be putting in the description box, that talks about the restrictions China has de facto on single motherhood, which is to say that social benefits, whether they're educational, medical, tend to be allocated, or almost exclusively are allocated, to 2-parent households, as opposed to women who are single mothers. This is an NPR article, so no surprise there. We can all imagine what the angle of it is. But the nuts and bolts of the article are such that these women are presented as being at a disadvantage, which they are in Chinese society, and that divorce and independent women are on the rise. And this, to my mind, is simply a consequence of urbanization and mechanization, nothing new to be seen there. But What I do think is interesting, important, and perhaps consequential for the long term is the divide we're seeing in how governments are going about their reproductive intervention. On the one hand, we have a free-for-all in the West, particularly in the United States, of do whatever you want, become a single mother, don't consider any of the consequences, you'll get all the benefits in the world, independent of the truth that typically is the opposite. And in China, where you have strong government intervention in every level of society, you have the opposite. And of course, people are complaining in the West about that. But if we see state level intervention in reproduction as an inevitable in the current climate, in the modern world of late 2019, I think we can look at it in terms of competition and which side of the continuum reaches one outcome versus the other outcome. Now, I'm a big fan of freedom. I'm a fan personally of certain classically liberal ideas, not the modern sense of the liberal, but the more libertarian sense, I suppose. But we need to level with ourselves, I think, especially when it comes to these types of questions. Is freedom the ultimate good in terms of long-term strategies for success? And we can define success in different ways. But if you want a society that's highly functional, is freedom necessarily the best thing? I would call that into question. Not because I'm opposed to freedom. I like freedom. I'm a big fan of it. It's what I'm psychologically most attuned to. I certainly would not want to live in a Chinese-style society. But nonetheless, I have to acknowledge that long-term, restricting destructive reproductive practices, such as single motherhood and single parenthood more broadly, probably is going to have better outcomes than allowing it to run rampant and allowing it to become a cultural good that is praised and thought of as the toughest job in the world. Now, this is not a moral condemnation of either. I'm usually not in the business of that, but simply an observation that state-level intervention in terms of the Chinese government, in the long run, is probably going to produce more fruit in terms of reproductive success and less societal dysfunction than what has been ongoing in places like the United States, Canada, and a few European countries, where single motherhood might not be the norm, but it is a norm, and it's perfectly acceptable. There's nothing exceptional or surprising, for example, about single mothers in their 20s or even their teens posting their pictures with their offspring in tow on, say, a platform such as Tinder for dates. This is regarded as normative, something that would never fly in the People's Republic. Am I praising the People's Republic? Not necessarily. I'm simply making the observation. And so generally, and much more broadly, I think we in the West need to openly ask ourselves and pose the question whether or not freedom itself is the highest good. And again, I like freedom a lot. I wouldn't want to live my life in any other way. Versus long-term effects of things and whether or not the Chinese style of going about things will, in the long run, be more successful. Because I can assure you, the Chinese are not going to be praising single motherhood anytime soon. They're probably not going to be changing their policies on giving social and medical support to single mothers. And as a consequence of this, I don't think single motherhood is going to be on the rise, because the barrier of entry to that is such that you will be denied certain services, actual services, and on top of that, there's a still persistent social stigma to becoming a single parent and or mother in this case. Whereas we have the complete opposite in a place such as the United States. Long term, what do we envision as being the more effective strategy, assuming that we're always going to have some level of state intervention in terms of reproduction? This is just the way it is. I am hedging my bets here, but I do think that China in the long run in this regard will be more successful, because letting people do whatever they want, and we have to acknowledge that we human apes are not the brightest of animals, is probably in the long run, in terms of a global competitive market, however you want to view that market, a recipe for disaster. And again, I like freedom, and you could argue, I suppose, that it's not really freedom because a lot of this is being propped up by the state in the West, and it's a bit circular. But again, we just come back to the point that the state is involved at level of reproduction, has been for quite some time. I don't think it's looking good for the West in this regard, and in many others for that matter, but time will tell. I'm not partisan in this, I'm just an observer. Gentlemen, as always, if I'm still alive, I will check you out later, and as always, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.